I was standing on my son's front porch holding a gift bag I'd spent an hour wrapping, close enough to the door to hear my daughter-in-law's voice through the screen window, saying my name the way you'd say the name of a chore you resented. I hadn't rung the bell yet. My hand was still an inch from it, hovering there while the autumn wind moved through the maple trees along their street, and I stood very still, the way you stand still when some part of you already knows the next 30 seconds are going to reorganize your entire life. I don't understand why she has to come to every single one of these, Priya was saying, her voice sharp in that particular way she reserved for people she didn't think could hear her. She just sits in the corner judging my centerpieces like she's grading a test. She likes Mateo, my son Nathaniel said, quiet, the way he always got quiet when he was choosing not to fight for something. Just tell her he's got a fever. Tell her the party's cancelled. A pause, ice against glass. And tell her to just mail the check. God knows we need it for the deck furniture before it gets cold. I did not knock. I have never been the kind of woman who bangs on doors demanding to be respected, because I learned decades ago that with a woman like Priya, confrontation is oxygen. She thrives on being the wounded party, and I refused to hand her that role twice in one afternoon. Instead, I set the gift bag down on the welcome mat, straightened and walked back to my car with a steadiness that surprised even me. I did not cry on that drive home. What I felt instead was something colder and clearer than grief, something that had been building under the surface for longer than I wanted to admit, finally finding its shape. My name is Margaret, and for a decade, I had been the quiet architecture holding up my son's family. I paid the down payment on that house. I covered my grandson Mateo's preschool tuition in full for 3 years running. I sent money whenever Nathaniel's voice got that particular strained note in it that meant things were tight again. And I never once asked for the courtesy of an explanation, because that's what mothers do. We cushion the fall so thoroughly that the people we're cushioning stop noticing there was ever a floor beneath them at all. I understood, sitting in my driveway with the engine ticking as it cooled, that I had spent 10 years being useful to that family in exactly one way, and it had nothing to do with love. I want to tell you who I was before that porch because I don't think what I did next makes any sense without it. I raised Nathaniel alone after his father passed when he was 11, and I built a life around the idea that providing was the truest language of love I had. I never remarried. I put my energy into a small accounting practice I'd built from nothing, into a modest, comfortable house, into making sure that whatever else went wrong in the world, my son would never have to know the particular fear of an unpaid bill. When he married Priya 9 years ago, I told myself I was gaining a daughter, and for a while I believed it. I overlooked the sharp comments about my old-fashioned opinions. I overlooked being seated at the end of the table at family dinners while conversation flowed around me like I was furniture. I overlooked the fact that Priya only called when something needed funding, never simply to talk. I told myself every family has its friction, that I was the flexible one, the reasonable one, the one who understood that keeping the peace was worth swallowing a little humiliation. There were signs, if I'm honest, long before that porch. The Christmas Priya rearranged the seating chart so I ended up at the far end of the table near the drafty hallway, while her own parents, visiting from out of state, sat close to the fireplace. The birthday dinner where she served my carefully made lasagna last, after a store-bought cake she'd picked up that afternoon, announcing loudly that she wanted to make sure there was something good on the table. The comment, tossed off lightly at a barbecue 2 summers ago, about how it must be nice to have so much free time now that I was retired, as though the checks I sent every month weren't the reason her own free time existed at all. I laughed along every time. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that families have friction, that pushing back over a seating chart or a cake would make me look petty and ungrateful for a family that had, in its own fashion, kept me close. I did not let myself add up what all of it actually meant, that I was being taught, gathering by gathering, exactly where I ranked in that house, and that I was expected to accept the ranking gracefully because the alternative was being labeled difficult. What I did not let myself examine, not once in 10 years, was the arithmetic of it. Not until that Tuesday on the porch, with my hand an inch from a doorbell I never rang. I drove home in a silence that felt less like sadness and more like the quiet before a decision. In my kitchen, with the afternoon light spilling gold across the table, I brewed a strong pot of black tea and opened my laptop, and I logged into the banking portal I'd maintained since my husband died. I clicked into the Scheduled Transfers tab, and there they were, laid out in front of me like the ribs of something I'd been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had gotten. $800 on the 1st of every month for Nathaniel's car loan. $400 on the 15th for Mateo's activities. $500 sent directly to Priya's account, labeled simply groceries. Month after month, year after year, quietly funding a lifestyle for a family that had just uninvited me from my own grandson's birthday so I wouldn't hover. I hovered the cursor over the first transfer. A mother's instinct is always to provide, to soften every landing before it happens, but I understood, sitting there with my tea going cold, that providing had curdled into something else entirely. I was underwriting a household that didn't want me in the room. I clicked cancel. I moved to the next line. Cancel. And the next. Cancel. I want to be honest about something else too. Cutting those transfers wasn't only about punishing anyone. It was the first time in a decade I'd looked squarely at how much of my own retirement I'd quietly rerouted into their comfort. Money that should have been building toward my own later years, sitting instead in Priya's grocery account or padding Nathaniel's car loan while my own savings stayed flatter than they should have been. Somewhere in the last 10 years I'd stopped being able to tell the difference between generosity and obligation, and sitting there with the transfer screen open in front of me I finally could. My phone buzzed against the table before I'd even closed the browser tab. A text from Priya, breezy and rehearsed. So sorry for the late notice, but Mateo's running a fever. We have to cancel the party to protect the other kids. So sad, we'll miss you. You can just mail his check to the house. Love you, Margaret. I read it twice. She hadn't even had the decency to let Nathaniel deliver his own lie. She'd invented a sick child with the same ease she used to ask for money, fully confident that I would simply comply the way I always had. I set my phone face down on the table, picked my tea back up, and let a small quiet smile settle over my face, because I already knew exactly what I was going to send her instead of a check. The next morning I drove to the pharmacy and bought the largest, most elaborate envelope on the rack, the kind meant for wedding invitations, thick cream cardstock with gold trim, and I brought it home to my study and opened a blank spreadsheet. I did not write an angry letter. I did not demand an apology. I simply built 3 columns: date, amount, description, and I went back exactly 3 years. The down payment assistance on the house. The installments on the SUV Priya had insisted they needed for safety. The emergency repair on their HVAC system the summer it broke. The boutique gym membership Priya swore was for a bad knee. Line after line after line, until the printer had produced 3 crisp pages of undeniable numbers, and at the bottom, a total that made me sit back in my chair and exhale slowly through my nose. I drew one clean red line beneath the total. Beneath that, in careful block letters, I wrote 3 words. Account permanently closed. I folded the pages into thirds, slid them into the thick gold envelope, sealed it, and drove it across town myself rather than trust it to the mail. I wanted it to arrive on my schedule, not the postal services. Their street was quiet, most of the neighbors at work, and I rolled down my window, slid the envelope into their mailbox, and raised the little red flag. The gift bag I'd left on their porch the day before was gone. They'd taken the present and left me standing outside like a stranger. I put the car in drive, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt no urge at all to apologize for anything. The call came at 7:15 the following morning. I was on my patio with a cup of coffee and a slice of toast, watching a pair of cardinals argue over the bird feeder, when Nathaniel's name lit up my phone. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Mom. He sounded rattled, breathless. My car payment just bounced. The bank sent an alert. Did something glitch on your end? I took a slow, deliberate bite of toast before answering. Good morning, Nathaniel. Nothing glitched. I canceled the transfer. The silence on the line had weight to it, the particular silence of someone recalculating an entire understanding of the world in real time. You canceled it? Why? The late fee is enormous. Can you just log back in and push it through? I won't be doing that, I said, my voice even steady in a way that surprised even me. I'm no longer funding your car, your groceries, or your patio furniture. I'd check your mailbox if I were you. I left something there yesterday. I heard the phone shift, footsteps, the tearing of an envelope, and then Priya's voice cutting sharp through the background. Who is it? Is it the bank? A pause, then the sound of paper being unfolded fully. What is this? Nathaniel's voice, thinner now. Mom, this is everything you've ever given us. Then the phone was wrenched away entirely. Margaret. Priya's voice had lost every trace of its usual sugar. What is this, some kind of sick joke? You can't just cut us off without warning, we have a lifestyle to maintain. You owe Mateo that much. I owe Mateo love, I said. I owe you nothing. You told me not to come and to just send the money. I sent you an itemized account of exactly what I've already sent. The bank of Grandma is closed. I ended the call before she could answer. I opened her contact, scrolled to the bottom and hit block because hanging up wasn't going to be enough. I needed to close every door I'd left open, not just the financial ones. Then I went out to my garage. For 4 years, Nathaniel and Priya had treated half of my garage like a free storage unit. Cardboard boxes of Priya's out-of-season designer clothes, oversized bins of holiday decorations, an old leather armchair they refused to sell but never had room for, David's, Nathaniel's, golf clubs shoved into a corner. I'd barely had space to park my own car in my own garage for years, and I had simply absorbed that too, the way I'd absorbed everything else. Not anymore. I rolled up my sleeves and started hauling boxes onto the driveway myself. I didn't hire anyone. I wanted the work in my hands. It took 3 hours, my back ached, my palms were raw with dust, but when I stood back and looked at the clean swept concrete floor of my own garage, something in my chest loosened for the first time in years. I photographed the pile sitting exposed on my driveway and texted it to Nathaniel with a single line. Your things are on the driveway. You have until 5 p.m. to collect them, or I'm calling a junk removal service. The typing bubble appeared, vanished, appeared again. Finally, I'm leaving work now. His truck screeched into my driveway at 4:30 sharp. He jumped out, tie loosened, face flushed, and went straight for his golf clubs, checking them for scratches before shoving boxes into his truck bed with more force than necessary. I stepped out onto the porch and watched. Are you out of your mind? He snapped, not looking up. Priya's having a panic attack. We can't cover the mortgage and the car without your help. And now you're throwing our things onto the street like garbage. It's my driveway, I said, leaning against the railing. And you're 34 years old. It's time you managed your own household. You're doing this because Priya didn't want you at a birthday party, he accused, slamming the tailgate shut. I'm doing this, I said, because I finally understand what I've actually been paying for all these years, and it was never a relationship. I walked down the steps and held out my hand, palm up. The spare key, Nathaniel. He stared at me the way you stare at someone who has suddenly become unfamiliar. Then slowly he worked it off his keyring and dropped it into my palm. It felt warmer and heavier than I expected. Don't call us, he muttered, climbing into the cab. I won't, I said, and I meant it, at least for now. Priya assumed, I think, that a few weeks of silence and the threat of losing access to Mateo would bring me crawling back with an apology and a checkbook. She was wrong. The first 2 weeks in my own house were strange in their quiet, but the strangeness gave way quickly to something closer to peace. Without the steady financial drain, I noticed my own budget breathing for the first time in years. Instead of sitting by the phone, I drove down to the community center one gray Wednesday and signed up for a woodworking class in the back annex, taught by a retired carpenter named Otis with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his jeans. He handed me safety goggles and pointed me toward a lathe, and for 3 afternoons a week I learned to measure, cut, sand and fail and then measure again. Nobody in that workshop asked me for a dime. Nobody expected me to babysit or bail out a car payment. We drank bad coffee and talked about grain patterns in cedar, and slowly, without meaning to, I built things: a birdhouse, a picture frame, and eventually, carefully, a small wooden sailboat with a hull I sanded until it felt like silk under my palm. I was wiping sawdust from that boat one afternoon when the shop door creaked open and let in a gust of cold air. Mom! Nathaniel stood in the doorway looking entirely out of place among the workbenches, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, dark circles under his eyes, the polished ease he usually wore cracked clean through. Can I buy you a coffee? He asked. We sat in a vinyl booth at the diner down the block, 2 black coffees between us, and he wrapped both hands around his mug without drinking it. Things are tight, he finally admitted, not meeting my eyes. Priya's picking up extra shifts. They repossessed the car last week. We're driving a used sedan now. I felt a flicker of sympathy, and I let myself feel it without letting it move my hand toward my purse. Adjusting to one real income is hard, I said simply. He looked up. We had an idea. Our basement's unfinished, but it has plumbing. We could put carpet down. You could move in. No rent. You just watch Mateo during the day while Priya's back at work full time. I stared at him for a long moment, and then a sharp, genuine laugh escaped me before I could stop it, loud enough that the waitress glanced over. They'd lost their free money, and their very next idea was to turn me into an unpaid, basement-dwelling nanny. Nathaniel's face fell, some final illusion about who I still was finally giving way. I'm not a nanny, I told him, sliding my coffee aside. And I'm certainly not a basement tenant. He slumped back in the booth. Mom, please. Priya's losing her mind. She's angry all the time. We need help. You needed money, I said gently. Not me. I heard her through that window, Nathaniel. I heard you agree with her. You built a life you couldn't sustain around a woman you let disrespect me, and that was a choice you made, not one I made for you. He put his face in his hands. I know. I'm sorry. I should never have let her talk about you like that. I didn't want to fight with her. But everything's falling apart. It's not falling apart, I said, standing and gathering my purse. It's resetting to what was real all along. I love you, Nathaniel. I love Mateo. But the funding is finished. I'm living my own life now. Panic flickered across his face. So what? You're just never going to see us? I didn't say that. I set a $5 bill on the table. If you want a relationship between me and Mateo, bring him to the park on Saturdays. Just the two of you. Priya stays home. If you can agree to that, I'll be there every week. If you can't, I wish you both well. He stared down at the table for a long time, and then he nodded, slow and defeated, understanding at last that the rules of this family had changed hands, and that I was the one writing them now. The following Saturday, I sat on a cold park bench under a maple tree shedding brilliant red leaves across the path, and I watched an old dented sedan pull into the lot. Nathaniel stepped out and unbuckled Mateo from the back seat. Priya was nowhere in sight. He'd kept his word. Mateo spotted me and sprinted across the grass, jacket unzipped, shouting, "Grandma!" the way only an 8-year-old can, and I pulled him into a hug that smelled like fresh air and laundry detergent. Look how tall you're getting, I told him, then reached into my canvas bag. I made you something. I handed him the little wooden sailboat, painted a bright, sealed blue. His eyes went wide as he ran his fingers along the smooth hull. You made this? Can we put it in the pond? That's exactly what it's for, I said, and he took off toward the water without a backward glance. Nathaniel sat down at the far end of the bench, quieter than I'd seen him in years, watching his son crouch at the water's edge. He didn't ask for money. He didn't mention bills. We didn't say much of anything, and for once we didn't need to. Something between us had shifted permanently, into a shape that was smaller than what we'd had before, but far more honest. At one point he glanced over at me, half a smile pulling at his mouth for the first time in months. He talks about that woodworking shop like it's a museum, he said. Tells his teacher his grandmother builds boats now. I build birdhouses mostly, I said. The boat was an accident that worked out. He laughed, quietly, and for a moment the tension between us eased into something closer to the ordinary rhythm we used to have before money became the only language we spoke to each other. It didn't fix everything. I don't think it was supposed to. But it was real in a way that 10 years of transfers never once managed to be. In the weeks that followed, I heard, through the quiet channel of a cousin who still spoke to both of us, that Priya had gone back to work full-time at a marketing firm downtown, that they traded the SUV for something smaller and sensible, that the deck furniture had never been bought at all. I felt no satisfaction in that exactly, though I won't pretend I felt nothing. Mostly I felt the particular relief of watching two adults finally meet the actual size of their own life instead of the size I'd been quietly inflating it to for a decade. Nathaniel kept his Saturdays. He was late twice in 2 months, and both times he called ahead to say so, which was new, and both times I told him it was fine, because I understood in a way I hadn't before, that showing up reliably was a skill he'd never had to practice while I was absorbing every gap for him. I didn't get their gratitude, and I likely never will. I didn't get an apology dressed up the way I once imagined one might be. But I got my peace back and my money, and a version of my own life that no longer required anyone's permission to enjoy. And sitting there on that bench, watching a small blue boat glide across the water toward my grandson's outstretched hands, I understood something I wish I'd understood a decade sooner. that love was never supposed to be a subscription, and respect was never something a checkbook could buy on anyone's behalf. If you're the one in your family quietly funding a lifestyle for people who'd rather you stayed home, I want you to ask yourself the question I finally asked myself on that porch. What exactly are you buying with all that giving? And is it actually love, or is it just the price of being tolerated? Tell me in the comments. I suspect more of you know that particular arithmetic than you'd like to admit.